Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on home transitions and retirement. Our presenters today are Alex Seleznev of Capital Squared Financial and Jan Brito of Capital Senior Solutions and Brito Associates of Compass. For those of you who are less familiar, Capital Squared Financial specializes in retirement planning. We specifically work with individuals and families who are planning for, transitioning to, or are in retirement. We also offer proactive tax planning, multi-generational planning, and each of our clients has an individualized investment strategy that matches their overall financial and retirement goals. We serve over 80 families and across 13 states and currently manage over 190 million in assets. Alex Seleznev is the founder and president of Capital Squared Financial. His specialty is helping people successfully transition into the next chapter of their life and enjoy their golden years. And with that, we'll get started. Alex, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for the introductions. And Jan, thank you so much for co-presenting with us today. Of course, we've known each other for over a decade at this point,
Yes.
and we've done, this particular seminar, just perhaps a different version of it, and many other webinars and seminars together. So it's always a great pleasure to present with you. And of course,
Alex.
Thank you, Jan, and thanks everyone for finding some time to join us today. We have a lot to cover, and I certainly believe it's going to be quite helpful to you because it is, in some sense, a very specific topic. So in terms of what we have to discuss today, the assumption is that perhaps you're exploring the possibility of perhaps selling your home and moving somewhere else. So what do? Do you sell and you buy something else, or do you actually consider selling and buying, which I understand perhaps not the most common approach, but I'll share some case studies actually from our experience with our clients when it really worked. Now, what if you're thinking about making your house retirement ready? What are some of the key considerations and ideas to keep in mind, specifically when it comes to in-home medical care? So we'll touch on that. And then hopefully it will kind of naturally dovetail into a conversation about potentially transitioning to a retirement community or CCRC at some point in the future. This is not necessarily meant to be a deep dive into it, but at the very least we'll cover the models, the most common models in terms of the CCRC option, specifically the buy-in component, which is quite significant financial commitment, and how it integrates with your long-term care decisions. So again, we have a lot of good information to cover. So we'll start with one case study. This is one of our real clients. Her real name is not Janet, but we'll call her Janet for the purposes of our seminar today. She reached out to us. She wanted to sell her house in Maryland and move closer to her family in North Carolina. She met with a good real estate person, and she estimated the value of her house to be right around $1,250,000. And in terms of our meeting, again, the approach was to evaluate what it would look like for her to sell the house in terms of the cash proceeds and how much money will actually be available for her next house. So this is where, again, many people make mistakes because they jump to certain assumptions, or they do, back of the envelope calculations, and then the actual outcome of that decision can be, less than optimal, let's put it this way. This is actually not overly complex, but this is a worthy exercise because, again, you are dealing, chances are, with essentially one of the largest or perhaps the largest asset that you have. So here's a calculation like this would look like. Again, we're trying to estimate how much Janet will walk away with. So she is single in this case. We have the final sale price. Let's just assume it's $1,250,000. There are going to be some expenses incurred as part of the transaction, agent commissions, repairs. I'm only estimating 3% here, but I can tell you in practice, it can be much more than that. And that's, by the way, when working with someone like Jan, who really understand the market, is important because you don't necessarily want to, overinvest in your own home, especially if you're thinking about selling it in near term, but we're just using 3% here. There'll be some closing costs. Again, I perfectly understand it can be more or less than that. Some staging expenses, moving costs, perhaps some other expenses that we need to take into consideration. But the bottom line, even after we do a calculation like this, the net sale proceeds are, over $1 million, or $1,087,500. Keep in mind here, if you see hopefully you can easily see the footnote on the bottom of the slide, a lot of the expenses will be deductible in terms of estimating your taxes. That's the next slide. So just remember, in this case, it's $150,000. So, but this is step one. We still need to estimate how much Janet, in this case, will owe in taxes. So that's our next slide. How would you do a calculation like that? Again, you start with the final sale price. You work with the assumption that you know how much you paid for your house. And I'll tell you, for Janet, just like for most of our clients in this area, she purchased her house many decades ago, so for $150,000. So that's her original cost basis. Since she's going to be selling it as a single person, there's going to be a homeowner's exclusion of $250,000. Keep in mind, if you sell it jointly, it's going to be $500,000. She also has $100,000 of documented house improvements, and that's important, especially again if you do anything major to your house. Keep the receipts. I'm sure you've heard about that in the past. And there are selling costs. I showed you the calculation on the previous slide. So when we do this math, well, it tells us that on this particular sale, we should estimate roughly, of course, $600,000 in net capital gains. The next step is to estimate your tax. 25% is a good ballpark estimate. It's long-term capital gains tax rate, so it's 15% federal for most people, plus state, of course. So Maryland, Virginia, DC, you're looking at 7 to 8 to 9%. So 25% is a reasonable estimate. The bottom line is, again, we start with $1,250,000, but in terms of Janet's next purchase, well, perhaps the target should be right around $937,000. So again, keep that in mind. You really need to do a calculation like this to make sure that you're working with realistic assumptions. So what are Janet's next steps? And this is where I wanted to cover the idea of renting in retirement. And I can absolutely understand that for those of you who are listening, it would be like, oh, whoa, what is she talking about here? I've been living in my house for the past 30, 40, 50 years, and why would I start renting at this point? And I perfectly understand that this is perhaps not the most common approach, but it's worth considering when you're making your decisions. So when is it potentially appropriate? Well, let's say we're working with, perhaps younger retirees, people in their 60s and early 70s who are still thinking about traveling quite a bit. And actually I had recently a conversation with people like that. They plan to be out of the country almost like for better half of the year. So for them, it's not that important to actually own their house. Let's just assume that you've decided for any reason that you want to move out of this area, but you don't know where you want to live. North Carolina, Florida, you want to move somewhere else, live closer to your children. You're just not ready to make that decision yet. Purely as a financial issue, again, this is a case-by-case analysis, in many cases it's actually cheaper to rent, at least in the short term, and I'll show you a case study in a moment. The bottom line is it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can always change your mind. Let's say you've been renting for 2-3 years, you enjoy your travels and you're ready to settle down again, or potentially even transition to one of the retirement communities as an example. Again, it's just one of the options. So here's a case study, a very brief version of it. There was much more analysis done for this particular clients. So they live in Potomac. They were considering selling their house for $1.8 million. They purchased it for $425,000. They made $300,000 worth of improvements. There's going to be a joint exclusion applied in their case, $500,000, and we estimated the cost to sell in their case at 6%. So as you can see on the left side of the slide, the long-term capital gain on this transaction was estimated to be $467,000. They're in a higher tax bracket. Not going to go in detail when we start dealing with people in higher tax brackets, but there are different surtaxes involved. So it's not just 15% plus state. So in this particular case, their tax would be over 30%. Now, in terms of the cash flow or net cash flow from the transaction, again, you start with 1.8 million, you subtract their mortgage, they'll of course fully pay it off. There's some cost to sell, estimated taxes that just needs to be set aside to make sure you can make that payment in April. So essentially over 1.1 million is available for the house purchase or for rent. In their particular case, they actually discovered, interesting enough, that in their own neighborhood they can rent for $5,000. It would be more like a long-term lease, and it's roughly $5,000 a month. You can assume that it's going to increase by 3% over time, perhaps higher than that. And in terms of this lump sum, 1.1 million, we'll also assume that it would be invested in a conservative portfolio, earning them roughly 5%. So as you can see here, they can now rent for 24 years. I'll tell you, it's very unlikely in practice that they will actually rent for 24 years, but it gives them that option. They can travel, they can explore. They're not forced to just sell and buy right away. So back to Janet here. So as we discussed earlier, Janet sold her house and walked away with $937,000 essentially. Again, net of sales costs and taxes. That's important. What are Janet's options at this point? Well, downsizing. That is perhaps the most common option and perhaps the most preferred. And I'll tell you again, Jan is the expert when it comes to downsizing. She even has a club dedicated to that particular topic. The only thing I will say, again, this comes from my experience working with our clients, you need to make sure that you have realistic assumptions. Because what happens frequently, let's say you sell your big house again in Bethesda, you move to a smaller place, you have this expectation that you're going to walk away with a lot of cash in your pocket. It's frequently, you're still going to walk away with some most likely, but it's not as large as many people expect it to be, again, once you consider everything I mentioned a moment ago. So just keep that in mind. The second point here, actually wasn't going to mention this when I was preparing for this seminar, but we have clients of ours, they just reached out, a month ago at this point. They decided to sell their house in Columbia and move to a 55 plus community, also in Columbia. It's like 3 miles away from where they live. So think of it as almost like a bridge option. You don't necessarily want to own your house, all that maintenance and everything related to that. A community like this could potentially be a good choice for you. Of course, they don't provide any medical expenses, so this is not a CCRC. We'll talk about that separately. But at the same time, again, they take care of your maintenance. There are lots of social activities for the community, so something to keep in mind. And then, of course, the third option for Janet is to rent and invest the sale proceeds to fund her living, medical, and perhaps her future retirement community costs. So this is, again, what I'm describing here. This is like the framework that we would use when we work with our clients in similar situations. Now, the next point, we mentioned this in the description of this webinar. I'll tell you, this is not necessarily the most common question I get, but I just wanted to address it at least briefly. Well, how much can you afford in retirement? Well, the traditional 28% rule, 28% of your income is how much you're supposed to spend on your housing, usually doesn't apply here, or at least it doesn't apply directly. And the reason I'm saying that is, again, for pretty much most of our clients who are transitioning into the next chapter or they're already in retirement, they essentially live off their Social Security, their pension, or perhaps mostly they live off their portfolio. So it needs to be the decision needs to be made as part of their overall financial plan. So as an example, the 4% rule, which I'm sure many people heard about. That's the safe withdrawal rule. It could potentially be a better rule of thumb in this case in terms of figuring out how much you could potentially spend on housing. But even that, I'm not sure if I would recommend that. A much safer approach is to run a projection. Again, it's a life event. If you're thinking about selling your house and moving somewhere else, well, goes without saying, that's going to be very impactful on your life, not just on your finances. So you want to analyze those scenarios. Okay, so switching topics here a bit. So planning for healthcare in your home. So let's just assume you decide that you want to stay in your house and you want to move somewhere else, and your goal is to stay there for as long as practical. Now, there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind. Of course, different home modifications that would make your house more aging-friendly. This is where I've done some research and actually attend different seminars on the issue. I'm really not comfortable with any kind of average. I mean, perhaps Jan would provide some from her experience. On our end, I can just share a couple of stories here. We have clients, they live happily in their Gaithersburg. It's a one-story home. They went through this exercise with us. We did the analysis for them. They just decided to stay as is, and in their case, it cost them, quote unquote, only $75,000 to make their house, aging friendly. There's a variety of things they needed to do. It took them less than a year. They're very happy. So it's, again, a case-by-case analysis. We also have clients, again, they're also in Potomac, actually. It's a 3-level home, and they were thinking about doing a variety of different things to the house, including adding an elevator. So when we did the math for the entire project, we're looking at close to $300,000, and they just decided to pause and rethink that decision. And again, perhaps that's one of the inflection points where you decide to stay or sell. Medical expenses. And this is where you have lots and lots of different averages out there in terms of, aides, semi-skilled and skilled care. On average, it's between $22 to $30 an hour. In practice, specifically for higher tier services, you're easily looking at closer to $40 per hour. So that keep that in mind. In terms of our area, the Washington, D.C. area, there's this Genworth study estimating, again, very important, estimating that it would cost you right around $87,000 a year to have that in-home care. I can tell you, again, from my experience, and I'll show you an example in a moment, those average can be quite deceiving. One thing I will mention, again, very gently here, there are lots of invisible costs of staying where you are. Just think about this. So for people who actually need this type of care, someone needs to organize it for them. Someone needs to find those aides. They need to manage them. You need to manage payrolls, billing, and all of that. In many cases, this are going to be your family members, perhaps your children. We have one client, her son is pretty much also in retirement, so he has time to do all of this, and that seems to be working great. But what if your children live outside of the area? So you're here in DC, and let's say your children are in New York. Exactly how would that work in the long run specifically? And I don't necessarily want to keep building on this story, at least not in our webinar today, but keep in mind it's not just a financial decision. You need to understand how it impacts the rest of your family. So here's a real example. I'm not making up these numbers. This is the actual budgeting exercise we went through with, again, one of our clients in January of this year. Just so you understand the setup, I've been working with them for over a decade at this point, and the family made a decision for the mother to stay in her house for as long as possible. Long conversation, but they made that decision, understanding the consequences of that. At this stage, the mother requires 24/7 care. So in 2024, her total expenses were right around $209,000, the total contract in nursing home care. In 2025, these are the actual numbers, they turned out to be $247,000. For 2026, they're expected to be even higher. So when someone gives you that average, what did I say, $87,000 for our area, that's just that average. In practice, and again, if you think about it, where you start with how you transition and perhaps eventually you need this care 24/7, it can be dramatically more expensive. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so hopefully this is kind of like a good segue into the next part of our conversation. So CCRCs, or retirement communities, or continuing care retirement communities, was what that stands for. I'll say it very briefly, but just to make sure no one gets disappointed here. We don't necessarily, well, we're always willing to help, but it's usually up to our clients to visit those places, pick the options that they like, and then we evaluate them from the financial perspective. So we don't necessarily, point them to any particular direction. We have people in our network who do that, by the way, and I know Jan has a lot to say about that, but our job here is on the financial side. So I just want to make that point clear. Now, this decision has at least three components. Besides that, obviously, it's a life decision. It's a financial, tax, and estate planning question. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. There are three common options out there. There's many more than three. They're becoming more creative, but this is one way to think about it. You have your monthly rentals. It's a monthly rental model, much less complex to evaluate from a financial planner's perspective, because essentially what happens, you replace a part of your budget with the monthly fee that you would be paying at one of the communities. They offer you a list of services, you decide what types of services you need, and you essentially replace them. Keep in mind that, under this model, perhaps one of the biggest disadvantages is the fact that your costs will likely, increase in the future. So that needs to be part of your plan. The second option is actually, I don't see it very frequently, but I know it's being offered, is when you have a declining entrance fee refund. And the way it works, you make a, usually a relatively large, upfront payment or buy-in. And in my particular example, if you vacate the property within the first, let's say, 50 months, your estate will receive a partial refund. So again, talking about your overall plan, that's important. Is that important for you, that your children perhaps will receive part of your assets or not? Because that would certainly impact this decision. In return, by the way, the monthly fee would usually be lower. So that's that trade-off you need to keep in mind. And perhaps the most common, but also the most complex one to analyze from our perspective is when there's a large buy-in, 50 to 90% of that is usually refundable. But again, it's refundable to the resident's estate. So that's important. Your funds are essentially locked in for hopefully for a long time. Why is it complex to evaluate? So let's say it's an $800,000 buy-in. We're just working with someone who's considering that. Well, unless you have $800,000 sitting in cash, well, then perhaps it's not such a difficult decision. But the question is then, of course, how are you going to fund it? Are you going to sell your home? Well, that's fine. That's what many people are considering doing. Again, I know Jan has many examples to share, but there needs to be a calculation of how that would work for you. If you're going to fund it out of your investment accounts or brokerage accounts, how much you're going to pay in taxes? Are you going to do it in 1 year? Are you going to do it in multiple years? If most of your assets are in IRA or pre-tax types of accounts, what will be the the tax if you decide to sell so much all at once? And that's again where, if people don't understand what they're doing, you can potentially make a lot of mistakes. Now, back to the buy-in component. Now, if you ever visit some of the communities, which by the way are improving each and every year, they seem to be looking and performing better and better. They'll occasionally phrase it as a form of investment, and in my humble opinion, I don't think of it as such. And the reason that's the case is because, well, there's no market appreciation, and it's payable to your estate. So it's just that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's potential for a significant tax expense if you don't plan for it ahead of time. So sometimes you need to be creative with your approach. I don't have it as a case study for today, but it was actually pre-COVID. One of our clients was considering transitioning to one of the communities. It would be very costly for her tax-wise to do it. She had four children, who were pretty well off. So they agreed to actually fund her expenses. So they would pay for all of it for their mother, and, you know, quote unquote, in return, they would inherit the house with, you know, step up in basis upon her death, and also her accounts, her investment accounts, would not be depleted. So, you know, you need to be creative with this approach. We had a couple of questions on the subject here. Perhaps we'll address them closer to the end of the webinar. But there's obviously a possibility of financial loss if the CCRC runs into any kind of financial trouble. I'll tell you, statistically, that is quite uncommon, at least based on what we hear, based on our research. One way I suggest you think about it, not so much in absolute sense, but think of it in a relative sense. So if you have $1 million and your buy-in is $600,000, you just locked in 60% of your assets in this one place, right? So if, God forbid, something happens, perhaps the impact on your situation will be quite significant. On the other hand, if you have a $3 million portfolio and the buy-in is $500,000, not that it's a small impact, but it's not going to be as significant. So I encourage people to analyze it, of course, review the financials of each CCRC, something we can help you with, but keep that in mind. Rental communities, in some sense, the pros and cons of rentals versus buy-ins are inverse. There's a much lower upfront cost, much higher flexibility usually. A good example of that is, again, the example I mentioned earlier, is if you're thinking about moving out of the area, you want to live closer to your children, but you don't know if that's the type of decision you want to make in the long run. So moving to a rental community perhaps makes more sense. Keep in mind, again, that your ongoing costs, if you stay there for a long time, will likely be higher. So that's important. That's just how the contracts work for buy-in and rental communities. And also keep in mind, this is what we kind of keep hearing, there's usually higher turnover in communities like that, perhaps for obvious reasons, because when you buy in, the intention perhaps is for you to stay there in the long run. So how to decide? Again, this is hopefully going to be helpful. There's much more to this, but I thought I would mention a couple of bullet points here. For rentals, perhaps you want to keep as much of your funds as possible, so liquidity is important. You're not sure if this particular community is where you want to stay in the long run, and you're simply not ready to commit to any single operator. With the buy-in, again, requires much more analysis. The assumption, in some sense, we must work with is that you want to stay there in the long run. You're, of course, comfortable with the community's financial strength, which we can help you analyze, and you value the cost predictability because of how, again, those agreements work. And I'll finish here with one of the success stories. I mean, this is a true success story here. This is, again, a real example for one of our clients who transitioned to Bay Woods in Annapolis. So it took over 2 years to make that decision. It's very rare when people just make those decisions on the fly unless they're health related. But essentially, prior to transitioning, she had close to $1 million in her portfolio. Her annual income, as pension, Social Security, was right around $147,000. There were some taxes here. So net of all of that, she had access to roughly $116,000. Now, the way we analyze it, usually they're fixed and discretionary expenses. So on the discretionary side, she had access to over $58,000 a year. Gifts, charitable, all of those things. Not a bad starting point. Absolutely. She decided to sell. She made buy-in, made that payment, $334,000. Her portfolio is now at close to 1.6 million. Of course, it generates more income to her. Her taxes would be higher as well. Her annual is net of taxes much higher. What's important here, the monthly fiat Baywoods covered essentially all of her housing related expenses. There's some meals involved as well. So that leaves over 129,000 for her to quote unquote play with. Doesn't mean that she needs to spend it. Perhaps again, there'll be gifting, some additional inheritance, but this is an example. Again, I'm only looking at it from a financial perspective of what it looks like before and after.